Hello, and welcome to the Rosewood Institute webinar series on psychodrama. My name is Nancy Berry. I am the marketing manager for the Rosewood Centers for Eating Disorders. Joining me in the studio today is Hunter Taylor, Clinical Director of Rosewood's Adult Services. Hunter brings 36 years of experience working in eating disorders, addictions, psychoeducation, and mental health management to Rosewood. Believing the modality of psychodrama is an important component of recovery, Hunter regularly conducts professional trainings for on-site in Tennessee. Hunter holds a Master's of Science degree in Counseling Psychology from Fort Hays State University in Fort Hays, Kansas. Welcome, Hunter.
Thank you. It's really a privilege to be here. This really is just one of my passions to talk about psychodrama. This short webinar will be a challenge for me because psychodrama is about being seen and getting up and doing things, but it's so valuable that I really wanted to spend some time and help the listener kind of at least get an introduction to what psychodrama is, and perhaps some of the listeners know about psychodrama and can relate to what I'm talking about and hopefully just expand their knowledge. So the way I start off the psychodrama conversation is to talk about one of my favorite quotations, which reportedly comes from Confucius. As you can see, it's I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. And this is just so relevant to psychodrama, is that, you know, research shows that when people just talk at an audience or lecture an audience, that the learning retention is pretty low, even on a good day. However, when you use some visual kind of cues and displays, the learning curve goes up. But the essence of psychodrama is once you get up and you participate and you do and you move with your body and you feel, that the learning retention really just dramatically shoots up. So here's an overview about what I'm going to talk about today in the little bit of time we have. I'm going to talk about psychodrama and or experiential therapeutic approaches, how they work with eating disorders. And I'm going to talk about what to expect when working with people who are physically and cognitively compromised with an eating disorder, and really talk about the importance that, first of all, food is the medicine of somebody that is compromised with an eating disorder. I'm going to give a short history of psychodrama, some of the tools, terminology, methodology, and talk a little bit about props with psychodrama and experiential work. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some demonstrations that I often do when I do presentations and training options for psychodrama development. Again, another quote, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and one needs to feel in order to heal. Truly, talking about something is one approach, but when somebody sees something, you can abbreviate the understanding through this visual approach. And it's really my belief and psychodramatists' belief that when people are actually role-playing and acting out of psychodrama, that their defenses become lowered. And when one's defenses become lowered, then that's an opening for a cathartic opportunity to feel. And it's really my belief that's when the healing begins. So why psychodrama as an approach, particularly with eating disorders? So people with eating disorders often are very defended. They intellectualize, they rationalize, they use a lot of cognitive processing, they minimize, and when people actually begin to see and have an opportunity to feel, it does present that opportunity for catharsis. The eating disordered population really needs to get out of their heads and into their hearts because they have lived in their heads with their disease. And so a psychodrama approach is to get to that feeling level that it's my belief and others' belief they really need to be in order for change to begin. So psychodrama is an alternative technique where clients and patients can actually see, literally see, their pain, their stuck points, their resistance, family of origin issues, unfinished business, their shame, guilt, and their eating disorder and addictions up close and personal. So I am obligated, and it is important for me to talk about readiness for psychodrama work with eating disordered population. So that needs to be evaluated and assessed. A severely malnourished person with a very low body mass index is not cognitively able to do deeper emotive work like this. The priority really is nutrition. Cognitively, an individual is just offline, if you will. Even if we did some emotive, deeper psychodrama work, it's not going to stick. They're not going to retain it. It may be a momentary kind of an awareness, but because they're malnourished state, it's really not recommended. So again, we need to really emphasize that food is their medicine until they begin to get more online where they can really benefit most from psychodrama approaches. So that priority has to be that initial physical restoration. The origins of psychodrama is really fascinating. Many of you may be aware of this. Some of you, this may be new information. In the early 20th century, there was a man by the name of Dr. Jacob L. Marino, who came from Europe to the United States, and the story goes that he was placed in a state psychiatric institution to work as a therapist, and he was given as one of his first assignments to do traditional group therapy. However, the group that he was going to work with was a combination of schizophrenics and prostitutes, believe it or not. Obviously, this led to a lot of frustration. The traditional group talk therapy approach did not work at all. However, one day, as Dr. Marino was walking home from his work, he passed a school ground and kids were playing at recess, and he noticed that they were, through play acting and spontaneous role-playing, resolving conflicts. And he got an initial inspiration that perhaps this is the way to really get a difficult population to open up rather than traditional talk therapy. Also, Dr. Marino was a fan of the traditional Greek tragedies. He was somebody that believed a lot in theater. In fact, he used to call the group room his stage and the group participants the audience. So Dr. Marino wrote books and is considered to be the father of psychodrama. Almost during the same time, Dr. Fritz Perls, who's the founder of Gestalt psychotherapy, began to demonstrate some elementary psychodrama techniques that he wouldn't necessarily name psychodrama, but he used such approaches such as the empty chair, where he'd be sitting with a client, and a client would, as an example, be talking about their deceased mother and having lots of guilt about not saying goodbye to one's mother, and Fritz would just say, well, see that empty chair? She's sitting there right now. Talk to your mom. And in that moment, the dynamics of the session would change, and the person would begin to feel deeply and have a response. And he also used the elementary technique of a role reversal, in which he would say, now change places, and you're now your mom, and say to you in the empty chair that is now you what you would like to have heard your mom say. So Dr. Perls used these basic psychodrama techniques and other techniques that others also used. Virginia Satir, who's a famed social worker who's now no longer with us, talked about what is called a family sculpt. A family sculpt is a frozen moment of time where she would use one's family of origin and have role players take the role of a father or mother, a child, siblings, etc., in which the client would look from the outside and be able to look in and see that frozen moment of time with their family. And the emotions would follow. And this became alive for that client versus just talking conceptually about what their family was. One of Virginia Satir's people that she mentored was a woman by the name of Wegscheider-Cruse, who developed psychodrama and sculpturing techniques and expanded it to what is called the experiential therapy technique. She also used a lot of family of origin work, and she added voice to the psychodrama sculpt and movement and even music and other action. And she went on to found an agency, personal growth agency called On-Site, which she is considered to be a founder of. And then perhaps the most refined name in psychodrama is Dr. Tion Dayton, which some of you may be aware of. Tion is still practicing in New York, but she's internationally known for being an expert in psychodrama approaches, has written multiple books that talk about step-by-step techniques in psychodrama. So you can watch her tapes, listen to her talk, and buy her books and see those actual techniques. My own training and personal work is that I went to On-Site, which Sharon Wegscheider-Cruse founded, and was exposed to psychodrama and experiential techniques at that agency. But I learned very quickly that in order to be effective, I had to do my own personal work. And this was a cathartic opportunity and experience for me that I had to resolve my own unfinished business to prevent me from projecting my own stuff on anybody who I was working with. So a good introductory skill is that skill of sculpting. So if I was actually doing a workshop right now, I would invite somebody to stand up, and we would have somebody play a real or hypothetical client and their family of origin, and through that observation, then you would begin to see actually how somebody's family of origin has power over that person. You would see the stuck points. You would see the opportunity for emotive work, and this will allow the client on a very accelerated basis to do some family of origin work or some work with things that they're stuck with, which could be set up, frankly, in like 10 minutes, in which you can do talk therapy and talk about it for an hour and a half, but not feel what a good sculpt does. I learned a long time ago that you follow the client's lead. You ask them what they need to work on. I believe it's a mistake to pre-script somebody's work, because that's not giving credence to the belief that intuitively the client really knows what they need to work on once their defenses have moved out of the way, once their fear has moved out of the way, once they're given an environment like a psychodrama to facilitate that. So it's really important to follow that client's lead and to go there. So here are some basic tools that any psychodramatist often use. We previously mentioned the use of the empty chair. Role-playing is an essential part of psychodrama. Inner child work is a real opportunity in psychodrama. And inner child work can start with simply remembering who you were as a child and getting somebody to role-play that person as a child. Or maybe that conception of that person, that entity inside of you that still needs nurturing, that needs protection, that needs to be parented by the actual client. And it may be that inner child that still needs to cry and grieve or to play and be spontaneous. So psychodrama is a wonderful avenue for inner child work. Psychodrama is also an opportunity to do some cathartic anger discharge work. The trained psychodramatist is always watching the client's body and expression, and obviously if there's some anger buildup, then the director, which is what the psychodrama therapist is often referred to, says, I've noticed some anger, do you want to do something with that? And if the client says yes, you would ask them where they're feeling that anger. An example could be, I feel it in my hands, in my fists. And you may do some anger discharge with what we call a bataka or an encounter bat, which is a foam-covered bat, and use a big block to discharge that anger and hit the block with that bat. And it's important that anger is focused and not diffuse or vague, and It's important that anger discharge work is not used if there is clearly no anger. So it has to be used responsibly. Good experiential therapists, psychodramatists that may use props. Props are simple, some visual kind of techniques that can be used. They may be something as simple as a baby doll, may be like a black cloth to represent greed. It may be a red cloth to represent anger. It may be something like a play fireman's hat that the client or role player wears to represent rescuing. It can be a sheet to represent a block. It may represent chairs turned over to represent chaos in one's life. It may represent a mask to show what the disease is. And a role player may actually put on a mask of a threatening menace that can be dealt with. So the creative opportunities are really just endless. Heating up is something that a psychodramatist asks the client. A sculpt may be put up and the therapist says, do you want to heat this up a little bit? And if the client says yes, then that may mean adding some voice to the role players. It may be adding some music to the psychodrama. It may be adding some music. It may be going deeper to some trauma work. It may be doing some inner child work. But the therapist has permission of the client to give that client an understanding they're really in charge, because they may be feeling somewhat out of control. But it's a reminder that they're in charge of this and that therapist is constantly checking in with them. The concept of public versus private work is really the gift of psychodrama. Public work is the star or the client doing their own role play, their own psychodrama. But private work is the role players and the audience relating to that star's work. And this really is an opportunity that everybody wins. An example is somebody may be role-playing somebody's mother, but it reminds them of their own mother, so they're doing their own therapeutic work. Some basic psychodrama terms are the stage, which is really the group room. Protagonist is a name for the actual client, or what we call the star. Again, the director is the therapist. Auxiliary ego are just roles that people take. Doubling can be somebody that is role-playing that person, and role reversal is switching. The example we gave before is somebody switches and becomes their mother, so they can actually mirror who they're talking to. Like any psychodrama, like any therapeutic work, there's always the importance of understanding that it needs to be done with some caution. Obviously, you need to be experienced and you need to be trained in this. There is that opportunity in a negative way to re-traumatize people if the psychodramatist is not well trained, is reckless, irresponsible, or I would say has their own ego wrapped up in what they're doing. So it's important that they've gone through some training, they've been supervised, they've been mentored, they've done their own work. Again, it's my belief that they have their own unfinished business, there's an opportunity that they may be pushing their own agenda onto the work. An example is that the client says, I really need to work with my mother. And the therapist has unresolved issues with his father, and he keeps asking, are you sure it's not your dad? Are you sure you don't need to do work on your dad? I really think you need to do work on your dad. So that's that psychodramatist, that therapist not resolving their own issues. Also, a real important caution is understanding that not everyone and not everything, needs closure. And sometimes just a picture is enough. Frankly, that was one of my earlier mistakes when I first started this type of work. I was under the illusion that all psychodrama work needed to be resolved, and at the end everything needed to be tied up and wrapped, and a bow needs to be put on it, and we do a victory dance that somebody has reached resolution. Dr. Pearls in his Gestalt therapy work said it best. He purposely created impasses. He purposely created frustrations in the client and then left them there just to feel. That sometimes is simply the gift of psychodrama, is to leave them in their frustration, leave them in their impasse, leave them in their feelings. because that's real world stuff. Now, sometimes truly somebody works through a point of resolution, but that is not necessarily the agenda. And an experienced psychodramatist knows that. Also, one of the cautions is also to give feedback guidelines for the group, and that is simply to ask the group to give feedback to the protagonist at the end of the psychodrama. What did you see? What did you feel? What did you hear? And more importantly, how did you relate to it? It's not about giving advice. It's not about interrupting the work while it's being done. It's asking the client, the star, to simply listen and take it in. Here's more specifically what not to do, specific examples of approaches that really don't work. Again, to somehow dramatize this, what I do in other demonstrations is I'll put that plastic fireman's hat on and start to throw Kleenex around the room to demonstrate that sometimes when somebody starts to emote, cry, show some real sadness, that some therapists want them to stop, and they'll give them a Kleenex. They'll try to rescue them from their feelings. It's important not to do that. It's important to not encourage group members to do that. I only allow Kleenex to be handed out to the client if they ask for it, to empower them to ask for it. Another thing not to do is to not hear the client. Again, if they say, I really need to work on my mom, is to not hear that and go on to something else. Also, important what not to do is to not honor no as a complete sentence. If somebody says, I really am not ready to do this, we need to hear that. We may want to probe about that. We may want to do a simple kind of psychodrama demonstration, what resistance looks like. But if no is their complete sentence, we need to honor and empower them that maybe that's their work. Maybe they've never said no before. But it's also important to challenge the client. It's also important to not allow interruptions by the other group members during their work. Usually when I'm giving a demonstration, this is a time where I will again have people volunteer and stand up and use psychodrama skills and techniques. You know, that's really how you learn this stuff. I mean, books are wonderful. Somebody giving a talk like I'm doing now are helpful. But the reality is it's important to seek out demonstrations and to be a part of that demonstration, because then you do and you understand. Something really powerful, and I even say something magical sometimes happens when you watch a psychodrama, you're a part of a psychodrama, then you see it and suddenly you're feeling right there with them. And you see what is conceptually talked about. These are some of the things that you can start tomorrow. If you're a trained therapist and you're degreed and licensed, no matter if you haven't been through real extensive psychodrama training, you can start with simple empty chair work. You can be sitting with a client and pull out a chair and say, wow, you're really struggling. What are you struggling with? I really need to talk to my dad. Guess what? Your dad's right here. Sometimes it can get even more powerful. If somebody is a victim of abuse, molestation, some trauma by the hand of somebody, you can invite that person to be that empty chair and say, your perpetrator's sitting right there in that chair. What do you need to tell him? And suddenly you'll see his affect change dramatically, and they are talking very directly to that perpetrator. Tomorrow, anybody can do a simple family sculpt. It's standing up, having people play your mother, father, and it's just a frozen moment in time. Nobody's seeing anything, but you say, let's look at your family. How did you grow up? Who was in your family? And have them just stand like a picture on a wall. And this, for a lot of people, is powerful. Just seeing that situation they grew up in. Mirroring is also a simple technique that somebody could do tomorrow, a therapist. It's simply giving them a picture of what they do look like. For example, you may have somebody very compromised with an eating disorder that's burning calories in the actual group session, and they're moving their leg 100 miles an hour. So you have a group member or yourself just mirror them, and your leg is moving 100 miles an hour. It's giving them literally a mirror or a picture of what they're doing. Role reversal is also a very simple elementary technique where they simply change places with the role. So here's a summary of what I talked about. Psychodrama can be a liberating approach to eating disorder clients who have not responded to other approaches such as traditional talk therapy. And it's an eclectic addition to treatment modality. Gets them out of their defenses and into their heart. You need to have that client who has an eating disorder ready nutritionally before you do that kind of work. There's a need for training and experience to practice this kind of work, to follow the cautions, and understand there's endless creative opportunities. There's no right or wrong if you're prudent and you are literally in the moment and you can choose to be creative and go this way or that way. It's also a wonderful opportunity for mind and body work. You may introduce some somatic experiencing work and some spirituality work in the midst of that. Here's just a brief bibliography. Of course, there's lots and lots of resources that I would encourage the listener to check out. Dr. Tion Dayton has multiple books out. One of her most famous is The Living Stage, which gives step-by-step techniques of psychodrama. One of her earlier works is The Drama Within. Family Reconstruction, Living Theater is a book written by Wegscheider-Cruse, which talks about experiential therapy, which is an offshoot of psychodrama. And there's a book that was printed years ago, but is still a valuable resource called Experiential Therapy for Eating Disorders, which adapts it specifically for that client population. Experiential Therapy for Codependency talks about specific exercises with experiential and psychodrama work that people can do not only as core work, but for warm-ups. So here's a place where you can actually send questions to. It's up on your screen, and now I can entertain some questions and go from there.
Thank you, Hunter. And I want to thank the audience and let you know that I have had the privilege of sitting through a few of the sculpts, and they are very powerful. I do have one question that has just come in. Does psychodrama re-traumatize people?
That is probably the most frequently asked question when I give talks and talk with people. There seems to be a fear that, oh my gosh, we're going to send people back to that original trauma and we're going to pile onto that. We do need to be prudent with that. But to not do it and use that as an excuse, I think, frankly, is somewhat of a cop-out. So once the psychodramatist is trained, you're constantly watching where that client is at, and you are able to go to a place where they can do some deeper work, but you also, as an experienced clinician, need to know where to set limits. So an example can be that if you're working with somebody and as a clinician you start to notice genuine signs of disassociation, then you are obligated to stop that process and to slow it down and to do some grounding skills. So irresponsible therapists can in fact re-traumatize people by being too aggressive, following their own agenda, pre-scripting the work perhaps. For responsible therapists, by following the client, setting some limits, and watching for some evidence of being overstimulated, can set limits around that, and it can still be a very effective use of a therapeutic intervention.
Okay, we have another question. Is psychodrama for anyone?
So that's really an open question. It's not necessarily for everyone. There are some people that just don't respond well to this kind of work. It's too much. It's too big. And so to continue to, if you will, force feed that is irresponsible. There are some people that respond very well to some methods of talk therapy, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, other methods of therapy, and psychodrama just doesn't work with them. They may be just too overwhelmed by it. And then with our earlier example, which we talked about again, if somebody is cognitively impaired due to a severe eating disorder, or I would also suggest due to addiction, if somebody's in active withdrawal from cocaine as an example, and you jump into a psychodrama during that withdrawal, you're irresponsible, it's not going to stick, and you probably are going to be ineffective with that person. And in fact, they may be so overwhelmed by it that they refuse to do any further work with you or that treatment center. So one size does not fit all, but it is an alternative treatment approach that is effective for a lot of people.
Okay, and we have time for just one more question. What are the short-term and long-term results of psychodrama work?
So this is probably one of the most asked questions is this empirically based? Where's your proof that this works? How do you know this is helpful? Or how do you know that it's more than just a moment in time and the next day somebody is back and forgets the work that they've done? There has been some research that has been done on this, and you can get online and look at those. One study that I'm familiar with looked at people that did some psychodrama experiential work for about 5 days, and before they did that, they did something called the Beck Depression Inventory and rated their level of depression, and then they went through a week of psychodrama experiential work. Then a year later, they were given that Beck Depression Inventory, and their scores were at a point that they were still in remission with their depression. And when there was collaborative information given, many of them a year later said it was because of the psychodrama and experiential work. Now some people will argue that's not empirically based. There is more studies going on to compare psychodrama versus traditional talk therapy, but I would suggest when you talk to an individual personally, short term and even long term, they will state to themselves, this had an impact on my life.
Okay. Thank you, Hunter. I appreciate the time you took to spend with us today. I'd also like to thank those of you who took time out of your busy day to join us. I'm going to flip this slide and show you what's coming next month. And we hope you can join us in December for the Adolescence and Binge Eating Disorders with Dr. Dina Cabrera and Kimberly Bobrovsky. Thank you so much, Hunter. We appreciate your time today.
You're welcome.